Good afternoon and welcome back to my channel. Today, let's dissect Sibiya's defense strategy. The Senzo Meyiwa murder trial has taken yet another explosive turn. Accused number 1, Muzi Sibiya, is no longer just defending himself. He's going on the offensive. In the witness box, Muzi Sibiya has consistently denied any involvement in Senzo Meyiwa's murder and repudiated the signed statements linking him to the crime. As the first defense witness, he showed the court wounds on his wrists and claimed police brutally assaulted him and forced him to sign a confession he said he never made. In stark contrast, police testimony, e.g. from Colomembotho, asserted Sibiya confessed voluntarily with no visible injuries. Sibiya also rejects key details of the state's narrative. For example, he denies ever identifying a traditional healer, Lion's Wane, to police after his arrest, contrary to what the prosecution claims occurred. In short, Sibiya maintains he never confessed, was never properly informed of his rights, and was only in police custody under duress. Sibiya's testimony puts the state's evidence under attack on multiple fronts. If the court were to accept his coercion claims, it could lead to exclusion of confessions. Coerced or involuntary statements are inadmissible under South African law. The defense is actively contesting the admissibility of Sibiya's and co-accused Ntanzi's confession statements. If upheld, those signed confessions would be struck from the record, stripping the prosecution of central evidence, undermining police credibility. Sibiya's detailed account of torture, being tubed and assaulted until he falsely confesses, directly contradicts police officers' versions. If the court finds the officers' testimony about Sibiya's alleged voluntary confession unreliable, it casts doubt on all related police evidence. Times Live notes this conflict. Sibiya showed scars on his wrists, caused by beatings, and insisted he was never read his rights, sharply undercutting the officers' accounts. Key links in the prosecution's timeline are challenged. For instance, Sibiya's denial of knowing the healer Zwane until he met him for the first time in court severs the state's narrative tie between Sibiya and other suspects. Likewise, any suggestion that he pointed out co-accused or materials, as police allege, is flatly denied. This fractures the prosecution's chronology, forcing the state to explain how Sibiya fits the crime if he never cooperated in the way they describe. Legal commentators observe that the state's case already faces coherence challenges. As legal expert Leo Mafosa notes, the prosecution's narrative remains fragile and has raised more questions than it answered. Sibiya's confrontational testimony, by drawing attention to inconsistencies and alleged police misconduct, amplifies these weaknesses, making the case appear even more disjointed. Under South African law, e.g. Criminal Procedure Act S217 and constitutional rights, any confession obtained through violence or intimidation must be excluded. Sibiya's detailed allegations of torture, for example being suffocated with a plastic bag and beaten until he wet himself, provide grounds to argue the written confession was not voluntary. The Pretoria High Court even held a trial within a trial to test this issue. If the judge were convinced Sibiya's statement was obtained under duress, that confession, and possibly related statements from others, would be inadmissible. Indeed, an MPA spokesperson has emphasized that the confessions will now form part of the evidence only because the court ruled them voluntarily. Thus, Sibiya's strategy was aimed precisely at negating that evidence. Even the possibility of exclusion forces the state to shore up its case with other evidence and undermines the impact of any remaining confessions. Sibiya's testimony also has implications for witness credibility. The stark conflict between his story and the police narrative puts both sides on trial. If the court believes Sibiya's account of abuse, it necessarily discredits the officers who claimed he was unharmed and cooperative. Conversely, prosecutors will try to portray Sibiya as a lying defendant with a motive to fabricate a torture story. In either event, the state's evidence is put into question. For example, Sibiya's claim that he was coerced into signing an unknown document contrasts with the orderly procedure described by investigators. Any contradiction like this gives defense counsel material to attack witness reliability. Even if Sibiya himself is judged untrustworthy, the episode highlights a troubling aspect of the investigation that jurists or judges may remember when weighing police testimony. Sibiya's denials force the prosecution to reconcile its narrative with his version of events. The prosecution's case has been largely built on linking the accused through confessions and purported common purpose. By repudiating key confession details, For instance, denying that he ever mentioned the traditional healer, Muzi Sibiya, injects doubt into the chain of evidence tying him to the crime. Media reports note that this severing of links is significant. Sibiya's refusal to point out anyone as police claim means the claim is contained in a confession statement that Sibiya deposed, but he denies making it. In practice, this means the state must rely on other evidence, for example ballistics or witness IDs, to place him at the scene. Any weakness exposed in the confession-driven narrative requires the state to revise or reinforce its timeline, which complicates the overall story. Legal experts and observers have commented on how Sibiya's testimony could tilt the balance. For example, Leo Mafosa told YFM that the prosecution's case was meant to tie everything together, but instead it raised more questions than it answered. The most troubling thing is the absence of key eyewitnesses. In this context, Sibiya's aggressive denials are seen as exacerbating those unanswered questions. Media outlets highlight the dueling versions. Times Live reports Sibiya on the stand, showing fresh wounds and insisting, "I didn't know anything about Senzo's murder," while acknowledging police testimony that he had confessed. The cumulative effect is to portray the state's case as contested at its core. In the words of one NPA spokesperson, the eventual ruling that the confessions were voluntary was a relief precisely because prior uncertainty threatened to derail the case. Sibiya's testimony, if fully believed, would have weakened the state's evidence significantly by invalidating its linchpin confessions and casting officials in a negative light. Even now, the incessant contradictions make the state's narrative seem fragile and fragmented. In sum, Sibiya's defense attacks critical elements of the prosecution's case. By disowning his confessions, claiming police coercion, and disputing the key connections in the state's timeline, he forces a legal and factual re-examination of the evidence. If the court or fact-finders give weight to his version, the state could lose admissible statements and suffer a credibility deficit. As legal analysts note, any such gaps further erode the coherence of a case that was already raising more questions than answers. These strategic denials, therefore, stand to weaken the prosecution's evidence by undermining both the admissibility and reliability of what were once seen as its strongest links to the crime. So what does this mean for the state? It means trouble. Sibiya's defense strategy, built on denial, claims of torture, and exposing inconsistencies, is creating serious doubt. The question now is, will the court believe his story, or will the state convince the judge that Sibiya's just buying time? Either way, this trial has turned into a test, not only for justice in Senzo Meyiwa's murder, but for the integrity of South Africa's entire investigative system. Thanks very much for watching. Remember to subscribe, and don't forget to like, share, and comment. I read every comment. I'm Skybridge. Until next time, goodbye.